Do we get a National Defense Authorization Act or don't we?
I think we do. There's some stuff in here that we don't like. Paid family leave, I think, warrants a broader discussion. But it's important to remember what we were able to push back on. There were a lot of priorities in the House version of the bill that aren't in the final bill, including, reversing the policy on transgender troops, repealing AUMFs, restrictions on border wall money, limits on ICE use of DOD facilities for detention, Gitmo restrictions. The list goes on and on. So there were a lot of wins in terms of making sure the NDAA was not unnecessarily saddled progressive priorities that have nothing to do with actually protecting the country. Finally, what the bill does include, historic military housing reform, significant improvements for child care, extensive civilian oversight of implementing the National Defense Strategy, 3 years of an intel authorization, emphasis on small business innovation, money for amphibious ships, adds 12 F-35s, 90-plus total, P-8s, E-2s, V-22s, a bunch of stuff in there that we like, most notably, and a big win for the president, the creation of Space Force, a fully funded nuclear modernization, and no big nuclear policy changes that the Democrats wanted. So on balance, this is a win, and I do think we get it across the finish line.
100 years from now, we're going to be talking about Space Force. And so tell me what it means that the NDAA officially recognizes a Space Force. Does it mean there's a new seat at the table for the Joint Chief of Staff?
It does. It effectively means that we will have a sixth branch of the armed service that is focused on competing and winning in space. And for all those in the media who are trying to make fun of this proposal, just look at the investment that China in particular is making in space. I was at the Reagan National Defense Forum this weekend with our mutual friend Robert O'Brien, and there was no one, even among the Trump haters, that was disputing the fundamental premise of the National Defense Strategy, that China is our biggest competitor, that China is a near peer competitor, that in many parts of this competition we are not necessarily winning, and one area where in some ways we need to catch up is space. And so this is actually the right priority. We can argue about the precise organization of such a new branch of the armed forces, but absolutely space will continue to play a more important role going forward, and it's critical to winning this competition with China.
So how specific, in fact, let me play something that Robert O'Brien said at the Reagan Defense Forum on Sunday. Hit the O'Brien tape.
When President Trump says 350 ship Navy, he means a 350 ship Navy, and not decades from now.
What's that mean, Mike Gallagher?
I think that's a strong signal directly from the White House that the Navy is not giving President Trump what he needs and what he promised the American people. By extension, not giving the American people what they need. We don't want sort of an abstract plan for 355 3 decades from now. We need a concrete plan for 355 a decade from now. And we can get there. It's going to require some creative thinking, but more than anything else, it just requires the will and the urgency from people at the highest levels of the Navy. The good news is that in the NDAA, we're buying 12 Battle Force ships. You can count on 3 additional new large and medium unmanned surface vessels. When you count those 3 vessels, we're at 15, which is more than the 14 ships we bought last year and the 13 we bought in FY18. But I'm glad that the National Security Advisor, Robert O'Brien, is sending the signal very loud and very clear that we need to get to 355, because on the current course, we are not going to get there. I'm tired of all these 30-year shipbuilding plans changing. I'm tired of all the excuses from the Navy. And I was glad to see from the acting Secretary of the Navy, Thomas Modly, he just released his, what he calls the SecNav Vector 1. In it, he really sends the same signal that Robert O'Brien sends. He said we need to establish an integrated plan to achieve a 355 or more ship Navy as soon as possible, within 10 years, is what he said. Within 10 years, not 30 years, 10 years. And so it's going to require Robert continuing to send that message. It's going to require the acting SecNav, the next SecNav, if he's confirmed by the Senate, to send that signal, and it's require all hands on deck to get this done within 10 years.
Now, the acting SecNav, Modly, good guy, from Ohio, by the way, a good Buckeye, he said there's going to be a plan. They can do that in one day. In Hugh Hewitt's humble estimate, I have talked to enough people who are not civilians and don't know anything like me, but who are in fact Navy veterans who know what they're talking about. you can actually come up with a plan in a day if anyone will have the guts to put it forward. They can debate some different modules of that. You know, what are we going to buy more of this or less of that or whatever, but they can have a plan in a day over there and they can all sign off on it, and it might require everyone to retreat into the tank for a full day and talk about it, but they can get a plan, and I think it would involve building ships in your home state and building ships all along the Great Lakes and all along Norfolk, Virginia, and Florida and Mississippi. It would just involve, and in Maine, by the way, submarines in Maine, it would involve building.
100%. You can develop a plan in less than one day. The plan is out there, and we know people that we could lock in a room to get this done in the span of 5 hours. And more importantly, Hugh, it's not a plan that would require you to choose among shipyards. I think we can keep all 7 shipyards alive and healthy and have a robust workforce ready to go, if not expand to 8 shipyards if we get this thing right. And so this is a plan that I think can be done and can keep everybody happy. But again, it requires leadership at the highest levels of the Navy and at the White House, and people consistently sending that demand signal. We just don't have any time to delay. And certainly if we lose the election in 2020, we can expect a Democratic president, any really of the candidates right now, to not be as forceful advocates for the future of the Navy. The final thing I'd say, Hugh, is I do think, however, it's going to require the Secretary of Defense, Mark Esper, who gave a great speech at the Reagan National Defense Forum and was great in Q&A, to potentially advocate more funding for the Navy relative to the other branches. And I don't say that just because I am a sea power advocate and a navalist, though I am, so you can take this with a bit of a grain of salt. But if you analyze the national defense strategy, and if you accept the premise that the Indo-PACOM region is the priority theater, then it follows logically that the Navy and the Marine Corps are going to be your priority force operating in the blunt layer and the contact layer, and therefore need more resources. And by extension, the Indo-PACOM commander is going to need more resources relative to CENTCOM, relative to EUCOM, and relative to other regions of the world. That is a metric by which we could judge the actual implementation of the national defense strategy. That is something I brought up with the Secretary of Defense directly. And I think we need to look back a year from now and really assess whether we are actually shifting resources in the right direction to the Indo-PACOM theater so that we can win the China fight, as opposed to spending all our money on the same things or on land-powered legacy programs that don't actually make any sense according to the national defense strategy.
No, I am reading from the United States Naval Institute website. Last night at 5:40 p.m., Megan Eckstein wrote the article. Acting Sec Nav Modley puts a 10-year clock on reaching 355 ship Navy. First paragraph, Acting Secretary of the Navy Thomas Modley has made a bold call. The Navy should reach a fleet of 355 ships, both manned and unmanned, within a decade. Now, this is exactly what you say is a demand signal. Does the fleet get it? And I mean, the people that produce this, who is the demand signal being sent to?
Hugh, well, to everybody in the defense industrial base, from the shipyards to, people on the joint staff. And the reality is, Hugh, what makes it so difficult is that the Pentagon is a massive bureaucratic organization, by some estimates, the largest bureaucracy in the world. There are a lot of antibodies in that building that resist any change, and people that don't want to disrupt the status quo, that are just collecting a paycheck and stealing oxygen within the building. And that's why it requires leadership, both of the department, but leadership from the president, from the Secretary of Defense, from the National Security Advisor, to really force change within the bureaucracy. Now, we have some very hopeful signs coming out, not only Modley's letter, but I would urge you to see if you can get the new Commandant of the Marine Corps on your show, because his planning guidance is perhaps the best and most strategic document that I have seen come out of the defense establishment in the last decade. It is actually incredibly disruptive. He's willing to question assumptions. He's willing to threaten legacy programs. He's the only person I've seen that's really thinking through the implications of the national defense strategy.
I would be honored to have the Commandant, and I want to close by saying I'm just amazed by your resilience, Mike Gallagher. My hat's off to you. You're up off the floor. You're here, and again, my apologies for last Saturday night, and enjoy whatever little bowl you're going to.
I appreciate that. How many wins do the Browns have right now?
We're on our way to the playoffs, buddy. We'll see you in the playoffs in the Super Bowl. Green Bay and the Browns. Hang in there. All right.